All right, I'll keep admitting people as they come in. But thank you guys for coming to Leadership Power Hour featuring Lacy, Dichary. I want to let you guys know that if you need the live transcription feature, that's available for you. And I believe that's it. I'll turn it over to you, Lacy.
Okay, great. Hey everyone, welcome to Leadership Power Hour. I'm excited to be here with you all. And I am planning on, if people want to jump in and have some conversation at the end of this, I'm excited to hear from you as well. But I wanted to kick off today with a little visioning exercise. And if I could just get everyone in the chat, I will want to hear from you for this. So, it looks like we've got some more people coming in. Great. So, I want to kick off with a vision exercise, and I want to describe two people to you. And so I invite you to close your eyes and let an image of this first person come in, and then I'm going to ask you a series of questions after that I want you to answer in the chat. So this first person is a person who experienced some abuse as a child. This person's parents had some pretty severe drug addictions, alcoholic tendencies. The mother was in and out of prison, ended up going into foster care, experienced sexual trauma, aged out of foster care, had multiple mental health diagnoses, had a lot of mental health challenges as an adult, struggled with trauma survivor. So I want to ask you a series of questions now, and if you'll type in the chat what came to mind. What does this person look like? How old are they? And this is going to be participation. How old are they? How much money do they have? (21). What kind of job do they have? What level of education? What kind of car do they drive? What does their family life look like? All right, thanks, Melissa. Could be anyone 21 and over. Okay. All right. And I want to offer the description of the second person. Now, this person played 4 sports in high school, was part of honor society, went to gifted, was selected for the statewide gifted academy in high school, had a full ride academic scholarship, graduated, was selected to become a national consultant, was an international speaker, got a scholarship to international conference when they were in their early 20s, became a published author, became an international speaker and author in their mid-20s, became a founding executive director of a national nonprofit organization in their late 20s, on the boards of national and international nonprofits, started their own business in their late 20s, 2 master's degrees, all before the age of 30. Now, same questions. What does this person look like? How old are they? How much money do they have? What kind of car do they drive? What kind of job do they have? Obviously, level of education. $45 and older, $100,000 a year. Yeah, Melissa. So a little bit different picture for this one. So did any of you picture the same person? Yes or no in the chat? could see it being the same. Yeah. Yes, I can see it. It can be the same. Yeah. Hiding where they came from. Okay. Yeah. So what I want to offer you all is that both of those descriptions are me. And what I want to talk about today is, what does adversity look like as a leader? What does overcoming adversity look like? And where do we gain leadership skills? Sometimes leadership can be thought about in a way that is limiting. Oftentimes when we think about leadership, we think about people in the corner office, or when I get to a certain role, or when I get a certain number of letters behind my name, when I have a certain number of people reporting to me, then I'm going to be a leader. And what I want us to shift gears and think about today is what a leader looks like, what a leader comes from, and where do we gain those leadership skills. And really what I want us to think about is, where did we get our leadership skills from, and what did our adversity look like, and where did we get some of those skills? So I'm just going to share my screen just as a guide as we go through this. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept of courage, right? Has anybody heard of Brene Brown? Okay. She has the Heart of Daring Leadership, and her first tenet of the Heart of Daring Leadership is that you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Embrace the suck, right? And I want to talk a little bit about what courage means and what vulnerability means in leadership. And when we think about vulnerability, oftentimes what we hear in our heads is weakness, right? A lot of times we think about vulnerability as being this hard thing that we've maybe experienced, or something that we want to shy away from, that we don't want to go through. It's sometimes this pit in our stomach, or sometimes this, feeling small or feeling weak. And what we have found in the Dare to Lead research is that actually courage is we can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And that vulnerability is actually one of our best measures of courage. So when we talk about leadership, when we talk about courageous leadership, we can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And so when we think about that person A, right, all of the hard things that actually I went through, going through some of the childhood trauma, going into foster care, and experiencing that shock, and that what was scary about that. Actually, those are some of the best leadership skills that I have gained over time. When I went to the Georgetown Leadership Academy, there were over 150 people in the room, and we were asked to reflect on, when was the very first time that we ever saw ourselves as a leader. And most people in the room went around and they talked about the first time that they saw themselves as a leader was when they got appointed as a project director for a grant, or they were nominated as a captain in a sports team, or when they were chosen as a president of a professional society, right? I thought about it for a long time. And the first time that I really saw myself as a leader was right after I went into foster care. And I understood that I was 15 years old, and I was the one that spoke up and said what was happening in my house with my siblings. And that was the reason that we got moved. And that was the moment that I knew that my voice could make a difference, right? That was what taught me that leadership could make a difference for my siblings. And then when I went into care, my siblings were placed in a home that wasn't great. And then I learned to speak up for them and advocate for them. And I called the social worker every day and was talking to them about what was happening where my siblings were placed. And after calling them every day and being that really annoying person, calling, then they got moved finally to a better home, right? One of my siblings came to live with me. Another one went with my aunt and uncle. And I learned that my voice can make a difference. And that was really where I gained the leadership skill of advocacy. That was where the first moment that I knew my voice made a difference, I could be a leader. Okay. That was courage. That was vulnerability. And that was where I learned that, okay, my voice matters. I can make a difference. And sometimes I want to hide that part, right? Melissa talked about hiding where I came from, right? Sometimes that does come up and I want to hide that part of my adversity. I want to hide that part of my background. But in reality, that was the very first time I really saw myself as a leader. That was the first time that experience came out, right? And so what I want us to be thinking about as we go through this power hour and when we get to the conversation is, where was your moment that you first saw yourself as a leader? Was it really in that moment when you got that position where you had a team reporting to you? Was it really when you got elected as the soccer team captain in high school? Or was there a moment of vulnerability where you stepped up and you had courage and you stood up for other people, or that you made a difference in someone's life? And I want us to think about, start shifting how we think about adversity as a potential for developing those skill sets of leadership. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I do want to invite you, if anybody wants to jump in and share. I'm used to seeing people and interacting with people, and seeing beautiful faces, and so this one way talking at screens. If y'all want to, if you want to jump in and chat, then feel free.
For me, I think shift is the right word, because you mentioned a lot. I think in terms for myself, leadership kind of changed from that title component, attaining like a certain, instead of it being, it was a destination and not necessarily a process or a state of being. And those titles were important, and that's how I saw leadership in the past, but moving more toward those actions now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Hello, beautiful people. I see your faces now. This is awesome. Okay. I haven't been in the rest of the session, so I don't know how those have been going. Yeah, and Dorothy, I appreciate your comments, because I think when we shift, especially as women, when we shift the way that we show up, we give other people permission to show up differently as well as leaders. And so I think it's really important for us to name how we can show up as leaders, and that leadership is viewed differently now, and that we have to be able to name when people on our team, especially, or when our students or when our coworkers are doing things that exemplify leaderly behaviors. We have to be able to name them for those people, because they don't necessarily recognize that those are leadership skills. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and that's a great point.
Yeah. Okay, I want to pause here and see if anybody else has anything to say before we move on. Okay. I came on here all ready to just like talk at you and like throw these things of wisdom, but I think you all have some really important things to say too. So, okay, cool. So I want to talk about, how do we get right? So if we have these really hard situations, so, you know, we live in an Instagram world where everything is, you know, a lot of things are picture perfect. We might be moving to a TikTok world where people have these videos and they're not picture perfect, right? They're not the cultivated, edited photos all the time. And that, you know, TikTok is starting to kind of take over, and it's the real raw stuff, right? Our hair isn't fixed, our makeup isn't perfect, everything's not edited. But in reality, we still have a lot of data that's showing that that we're not living in that reality day to day. We still have these images that are out there that aren't real and authentic, and we're still battling against that, right? And so when we have to live our most authentic selves, it still takes courage. Okay. And so we have to embrace that suck and embrace that vulnerability and authenticity for us to be able to give other people permission to do the same. And so when we talk about leadership, it's not limited to a position, and leaders are anyone who is challenged and willing to take on developing the potential in people and processes. Okay. And so by that definition, all of us have the potential to be leaders. And so I want to share a quick story about that. I remember, so my first job out of college as a consultant, a national consultant, I remember going to work every single day, and I carried this makeup bag with me every day. And I carried that with me every day, not because I cared so much about makeup. I was actually a tomboy, wasn't a big deal. But because I was having mental breakdowns in the bathroom every day. I wasn't okay, but I didn't feel like I could tell everybody that I wasn't okay. And so I would go to the bathroom, I would have a breakdown, I'd be crying in the bathroom every day. And then I would take my makeup bag with me because I would put my makeup back on and come back out and pretend like everything was fine because I didn't feel like I could say what was really happening. And so one day I remember taking my makeup bag with me to the bathroom, looking in the mirror, my face was all red and splotchy. And I remember looking at myself in the mirror, and I decided, no, I'm not going to put my makeup back on today. I'm going to walk out into the hallway, walk down the hallway back to my cubicle. And if somebody asks me if I'm okay, I'm going to say, no, I'm not okay. Right. So anybody ever had that situation? Anybody feel like can relate to that story? Even if it's not a real makeup bag. And so that's that authenticity, right? That's the vulnerability that takes courage nowadays, that we've got to be able to embrace that suck and be real and honest. And so when I did that and I took that step and said, I'm not okay, and I was willing to let somebody else see that, I didn't know who was going to see it, but my director saw me walking down the hallway and said, are you okay? And I had the courage to say, no, I'm not okay. And she took me in her office and we sat down and we had a real conversation and we talked, and I was able to get support and get help that I needed. And for her, stepping in and being a leader in that moment meant giving me space, right? She had a million things on her list that she probably had to do that day, as we all do. But her being a leader meant stopping in the moment and meeting me where I was and giving me what I needed, right? How many times a day do we bypass those moments as leaders, as people who have team members or students coming in the door day in, day out? How often do we stop and step into that courage and that moment where we know like something's kind of off? We don't stop and we say, how are you? Okay, great. We move on. We get to our to-do task, but we don't stop and we say, how are you really? We don't follow up with that second question, right? And so we've got to be able not only to have the courage to show up as our authentic selves, because research shows in multiple settings, but even so far as healthcare settings that talk about companies with authentic cultures where people can truly show up as themselves, have more productive outcomes. Healthcare settings have better patient outcomes if people can show up as their authentic selves, right? And so we've got to be able to be that leader that gives permission by example for people to show up as their authentic selves. And that's courage. That's leadership. How do we do that? By leading by example. Yeah. And Sarah, I love that question. Would it be the same if it was with a male boss? Because she was a woman. And I would put that back to you and the group to consider that. I think it is easier because she was a woman. I think in that example, I also had a male boss who was my direct supervisor, who I could be exactly just the same vulnerable and emotional with. Not everybody has that situation. but how do we show up? So then the question becomes, how do we start setting that culture in that example? So let's pause here. What does everyone else think? What are your thoughts about how do we step up as a leader, and how do we start setting those examples and those situations as a leader to create those authentic cultures in our settings? Anyone can jump in.
I really wish I had an answer, but I do feel like I have to put on a stronger face, or, be a stronger version of myself, when I'm dealing with a male boss, versus my previous employer was a female boss that was close to my mother's age. So she treated me like a daughter, so it was a little bit of a different dynamic there as well. But she knew a lot about my life and things that were going on. And she asked me, and, my current male boss does the same. He knows about what's going on in my life, but I don't know that I feel the same way. Like I could be vulnerable, in that space. So
yeah,
I don't, I wish I knew the answer. Maybe it's my own internalized perception of how he would respond. Maybe that has nothing to do with him as a person. It's just how I assume he would respond to me if I were being emotional or vulnerable.
Sure.
I think we see, we see vulnerable as a bad word. And I think a lot of times we equate vulnerability with weakness, and it's quite the opposite. I think it's really easy to pretend that everything's okay, you're invincible, nothing's going to bother me, nothing's going to faze me. When actually being vulnerable, being real, takes a lot of strength. And I think it's a cultural shift of being like, vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is being real. You can be vulnerable with me. I can be vulnerable with you. Of course, don't cross any corporate lines, but I think it's important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, vulnerability needs trust, and trust needs vulnerability, right? And so it's a stacking process. We don't want to come to somebody that we don't have trust with and bring all of our most vulnerable stuff to them, right? That's not what we're saying, but we are saying that if we're never vulnerable with anybody, we're not going to build any trust, right? But if we don't trust anybody a little bit, we're never going to be able to be vulnerable with them. And so it's this slow stacking process. And I want to note that there are definitely power differentials. Oppression does exist. Power does exist. And so we have to be aware of those things. And that is why it takes courage to be vulnerable, to start those relationships. And so that is also why we're talking about leadership from any position. And so you can be a leader where you are by starting to set that example. And so what does that look like to take that one next step, right? How do you take that one next step of starting to set that trend and that example of vulnerability, one little step at a time? Does that make sense?
I've found that it's a little bit easier to practice vulnerability with my student athletes because, again, you talked about that power differential. So when I'm meeting with the student athletes, I'm trying to be vulnerable with them in like that appropriate, professional way. But I find that it's something that I've been able to use to help build trust, to show authenticity, to make those connections. So in the meetings with the student athletes, it like this model really makes sense. And I haven't done it as much in the professional side of it with my coworkers or my boss, or kind of beyond that. So it's interesting to think about it and how it's easier to roll it out in certain situations than others.
Yeah. So maybe it feels a little bit safer with the student athletes for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think it's more about I'm trying to help them be vulnerable, especially in the meetings with what we're doing, because they have to be able to let us know if things aren't going well, because if we're trying to take this holistic approach to support. And if they don't trust me and they don't see me as somebody that's willing to make those connections, it can be harder. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So I want to keep moving and think a little bit more. So how do we keep pushing this? How do we set that example? How do we sort of flex our leadership skills and keep moving in a place that might not be as safe and comfortable? And so I want to talk through this idea. We transmit what we don't transform. Okay. So the second concept in the heart of daring leadership is who we are is how we lead. Right. And so we carry around all of our experiences with us, right? All of our adversity, all of the hard things that we've gone through. And if we don't sit with those, invite those in, heal those, then we're carrying those around and we transmit those, whether we know that or not. And so maybe it's somebody kind of rubs up on the edge of that. Maybe we carry that through armor. Maybe we keep walls and we're closed off from some of our colleagues or people that we could otherwise become true leaders of, right? And so, I did not play sports in college, but I was competitive in high school. I played 4 sports, and so then I wanted to keep that competitive streak going whenever I did go to college, and so I competed in MMA, cage fighting, as most people know it as, and so. For my fight club that I was in, when I would do training, part of the training I would do is in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so what my coaches would do is, they would have me train with these guys, and I was the only female, and I was in a whole fight club with like 30 guys. And so I was with these guys that were about 50 pounds heavier than me, much stronger than me. A lot of them were like law enforcement or special ops Navy. And it was like very intense. And I would learn these new moves in jiu-jitsu. And I mean, it's just incredible experience for women to experience this kind of training, because you start in a very compromised position and you learn how to submit your opponent from that position as part of your training. And so I would roll and roll and roll, and they would not let up on me because they knew that my opponents, when I started to train and fight, would not let up on me either. And so, but I would train with these guys that were 50 pounds bigger, just massive, and they would not let up. And I felt for months like I was not learning anything. I couldn't get the moves down. They wouldn't go easy on me. They wouldn't slow down. And it was so hard. It was so hard and unrelentless. It felt like, right? Constantly over and over and over again. And I just felt so defeated all the time. And then finally, after a few months, and they knew that what they were doing, my coaches knew what they were doing, but I didn't know this while I was going through it, right? After a few months, then they finally put me with guys that were my size, my weight, for me to roll and train with. And then it was like magic. It was like everything all of a sudden came together. I knew all of the moves that I was supposed to know. I was able to execute the moves with precision. I knew all of the submissions that I was supposed to know. I mean, it was like all of a sudden magic, boom, everything locked into place. And it was because they had made it so much harder for so long that then when it came time for me to execute those skills, it was like second nature. Okay. So when we think about that in life, sometimes, and it might not be intentional, but sometimes when we go through adversity, it can be like that. Adversity can be our teacher that teaches us the leadership skills that we need, the resilience skills that we need. We don't always recognize it when it's happening, right? And so if we can learn to accept adversity for what it is, right? A lot of times the pain and the struggle, we want to put that behind us. We want to resist it. We want to ignore it. We want to put it to the side because it hurts. It's painful. It's hard, right? But if we can learn to accept it for what it is and engage with it and recognize that, okay, I'm growing in this moment. I am learning from this. I am gaining skills in this. Then we can learn to look for the leadership skills in that moment. So my question to you is, what are the adversity moments that you've had that you've maybe like pushed away, that have been painful, that you haven't wanted to look at, that actually have been really huge teaching moments for you? So you can share, you can unmute and answer, or you can put in the chat, or you can reflect on those. But I really want you to think through, what are the hardest moments? What are the struggles that you've had that you didn't realize until later were actually leadership building moments? And how might you work to embrace those in the future? So does anybody want to jump in here before we go on?
I think back when you were talking about this just now to like the year of 2016, which was a really just challenging year for us here. We had a flood in the city of Baton Rouge that, you know, flooded a lot of people that had never flooded before. A lot of people had multiple family members impacted. We had transitioned to a new HR and financial system that year. So a lot of us were still learning. We kind of felt, you know, maybe we were underprepared for that transition. So, and then people that we were supposed to be relying on were flooded and not at the office, you know. So I just remember that being, at the time, feeling overwhelming. And now kind of looking back, you know, I see how much I've grown from being able to overcome all of those things. You know, I had to figure out at that time kind of where I was mentally too, and realize when I needed to look for help and, you know, find someone to help me find my way. But even still, like now that I know what I had to go through to overcome that, you know, I kind of feel like it has prepared me for the next transition, you know, system transition, or the next major catastrophic weather event or something like that, because you've kind of been there, done that. You know, you feel like you're a little more prepared, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so when you've gone through that, and in the moment, it probably didn't feel like, hey, I'm learning leadership skills. Like, you didn't think about it in the moment, or, hey, I'm going to be so much better prepared for next time. Right. But change management, dealing with ambiguity, strategic agility, emotional regulation, right? All of those are leadership skills that you just named. Maybe you didn't realize that those were what you were gaining or what you were talking about, but those are leadership skills that you earned during that time. Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm a person in long-term recovery, and my sponsor always talks about how, you know, pain is the touchstone of spiritual progress. And spiritual progress never feels like it in the moment, right? It feels like pain in the moment. And we don't always get the revelation that it is growth until the future, right? And we only see that in hindsight. And so that's sort of the concept now. And so if we can start to recognize when we're going through adverse moments in the moment, then we can start to accept them and say, okay, what am I learning right now? What is the opportunity of what I'm going through right now? We'll have less struggle, and we can learn to embrace those leadership skills sooner and more readily, so that we can be more useful in the moment and to those around us. All right. Anyone else want to jump in before we go on? All right. And so what I like to talk about is transformational leadership. And so when we talk about leadership not being limited to a position, we talk about positional or formal leadership, right? And so that's when someone has somebody that reports to them, they have power, they have authority. And what we're talking about is leadership is a way of showing up, a way of being, and anybody has the potential to be a leader in that sense. So it could be your students, it could be you, it could be somebody on your team. And it just takes shifting the way that we think about leadership to be able to show up as a leader, recognizing that you have leadership skills, being able to name where did you get those leadership skills, embracing some of the hardest things that you've been through, or maybe what your student athletes have been through, or what your peers have been through, to be able to recognize that those actually have a lot of leadership strength in them. And then being able to shift those and say, okay, if I have been able to take these hard experiences and get leadership skills out of them, you can too, right? And so we don't want to limit ourselves and how we think about us as leaders, but we also don't want to limit how we're thinking about other people as leaders, right? And so in transformational leadership, it's not just about getting other people to get together on the same page in a unified vision to move forward together. Transformational leaders actually leave leaders in their wake, right? It's not just about getting followers together and unified. It is about leaving, it transforms the followers into leaders themselves. Does that make sense? So when we think about transformational leadership, what stands out to you about transformational leadership? What's different about that than normal formal leadership positions?
I think for me, what comes to mind is that it can be a shared experience. It's not a leader follower kind of dynamic. It's let's all kind of go through this together. And it could be a dynamic where when if I need some assistance, you're there to assist. When you need some assistance, I'm there to assist. So it's not a pyramid. It's we're all going in the same direction together.
Yeah. So I can be changed by you and you can be changed by me. And maybe if even though I have the title of leader or I'm the captain, I can be changed by you. You have something to offer me as well. Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely.
I think transformational too involves like the word trust. So it ties right back to vulnerability. And I think that that's kind of a question that I have for you or for the group is like with your coworkers or colleagues or those that you supervise, like what are some ways that you can continue to like create a safe space for them so that they do feel vulnerable speaking to you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, there's a big fear, especially in a workplace where vulnerability can lead to like showing vulnerability could be perceived as like not being able to handle the workload or not being proficient in your job. And I think really creating a culture where you understand, kind of like I was saying before, we all have times where we need other people. So if we create kind of a teamwork dynamic, you can be vulnerable and I got you. When I'm vulnerable, I have you. Then maybe that'll shift the conversation where it's not a level of fear of if I show I'm scared, it shows I can't do this job. It shows it might affect my performance or evaluations or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And so you're getting into there's some trust, right? And then there's also this concept called psychological safety, where you can do some activities to kind of help to build that. And they're kind of interwoven, but psychological safety is really about how do we set this container to where everybody feels like they can speak up. Everybody feels safe to ask for help. Everybody feels safe to speak up and say, hey, I made a mistake, or I don't know how to do this, or how do we learn this together, right? Everybody feels like they can come up with new ideas and they don't feel like they're going to be shot down, right? And so that's those are all different ways that we can create a container and help people feel safe, right? So some of that we do have to build trust with each other. And so again, that vulnerability builds trust builds vulnerability. And how do we create where the whole team feels like they can feel safe and they can speak up with each other? And so part of it is being able to, as we talked about, be authentic yourself, right? As a leader or as somebody on the team, when you can be authentic and you can step out and have that courage, you're giving other people permission to also do the same, right? And then if you're the leader, or if you have some kind of power in that dynamic, you can also set that container and say, you know, we're going to do team building activities at the beginning of every meeting, or, you know, you can build, do an assessment, kind of see where your team is, but then also start building intentionally where you feel like you need the team to go. And so you can ask questions, do team building activities, and start having those real conversations so that you can start building that psychological safety and that trust. Does that make sense, Camille? What else would everyone add? What else has worked for you?
I mostly supervise student workers. So, you know, it's not necessarily full-time staff, younger crowd, but I find that if I just ask questions, you know, stay engaged and interested in their life, and eventually you'll hit on something that's important to them or sensitive to them, or, you know, and you never know, they might all of a sudden just open up and share something with you because you've been consistent in asking and taking an interest in their life and what's going on. So I assume it's probably pretty similar to how coaches and advisors and other academic support professionals, you know, work with their student athletes, just kind of building that rapport, building that relationship. So this may be a younger group, but I feel like it would transfer to the full-time crowd as well.
Yeah.
So this is Dawn. I work at Disability Services. I work with student athletes. I also in a supervisor role and work directly with student athletes as well as other students. But that vulnerability part, I think, is so crucial to, you know, expecting people to be vulnerable with you. I think you can lead by example. And I think it's really hard for someone to trust that they can be vulnerable with you if you haven't placed that same trust in them. So I think that for me, just showing that humanness to folks that you supervise, and while, you know, maintaining that leadership role, but also letting them know, like, I'm human, so I can understand, or I'm noticing something different about you. You know, I think finding common ground helps to facilitate that communication and to get beyond a surface level discussion. So, you know, part of my story is my son was diagnosed with a disability in 2nd grade, which is how I've gotten involved with disability services as a career. And I oftentimes bring him up because I want students that register with our office to know that I can relate, because this goes beyond a job. For me, this was, you know, I lived with my son that I love very much that had this, and that we're going to find a path for you to be successful. I'm on your team. So I think just trying to find that common ground while at the same time being vulnerable with them, you can model that for them and give them maybe a little bit more encouragement to be vulnerable with you.
Yeah, it's great. Again, it's that lived experience giving you a leadership skill that is very specific to what you're doing and serving your students. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, and so what I just really want to encourage and hone in is, you know, we all have things that we've gone through. We all have parts of us and experiences that, you know, have been hard or challenging or difficult, and emotions that come with those experiences that we'd like to, you know, not think about or push away, that because they're hard, they're painful, right? But what we resist persists. And if we don't engage with that, you know, that can be the best source of strength. It can be the best source of leadership skills. It can be the best source of vulnerability and strength that we have to offer to our students, to our peers. It can be the best source that we have for leadership skills. But if we don't use it, it can drive a lot of negative behaviors that we might not even be aware of as a leader, right? And so I just encourage everyone that I work with. I do a lot of leadership consulting and work with groups around courageous leadership. And a lot of that has to do with going back inside of ourselves and engaging with the parts of us that have been the most challenging, or the parts that we've wanted to resist the most. And so what I like to challenge everyone to think about is, what story are you telling yourself about your experience that is holding you back from your leadership potential, right? I could have easily, how we started this session, I could have easily, and I have very often told myself, I am just a foster kid. I have all of these mental health challenges because of what I've been through. Who's gonna pick me? Who's gonna believe me? Who am I to do any of this work, right? And I could have stayed in one tiny little town in a tiny little Midwest state and not really gone out and done a whole lot of anything. And instead, I have sometimes, usually, chosen to believe that I could make a difference because of the story that I've had, because of the life that I've had, because of the hard experiences that I've been through. I made a difference for my siblings. And then I joined with other kids who have had a really hard time, right? A lot of our student athletes don't come from great backgrounds, and they can make a huge difference in their communities and for other kids like them and other youth that have been in hard situations. First generation college student, 2% of youth in foster care actually graduate from undergrads, and now I'm getting a PhD. And so I can go and share that experience. I could be ashamed of it and never tell anybody, or I could go and tell everybody. And it's up to us what story we tell ourselves about our experience and how we choose to use that, especially as a leader. And so I want to, with the last couple minutes that we have here, I want to encourage you to think about, what's the story that you're telling yourself about your experience? And I want to take that one step further. What are the limits that you're putting on your team and your students about their experiences as well? So I'd like to, if anybody wants to share in the chat or unmute, what are your thoughts? What stories are you telling yourself that are holding you back from your leadership potential?
I think for me, sometimes it's age. Like I was placed in a position more of like leadership and directorship, and I'm like 30 or like 29. And so like even having colleagues that'll mention like the age component, and just because I'm younger and might not have as many life experiences doesn't mean that I can't be a leader. And so I think that's something that I just need to stop telling myself, that there's lots of potential and obviously still have room for growth, but I need to be my authentic self. And like, I'm proud of where I'm at and where I'm going. And so I can't listen to what other people are telling me.
I love that. Our student athletes are what, 21, 22, leading teams to national championships every single year. You're 30, you can lead teams in university every day. Yeah, anyone else?
I think for our students, a lot of times they see themselves, or they can picture themselves, they're a leader in their sports or in athletics, but transferring that leadership into other aspects of their lives because of experiences or because of whatever else. It's proven in athletics, but when you try to talk to them about, no, you're a leader, we have a platform, you're able to do all these great things. I think that's where the challenge comes in sometimes with some students.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so it's really, if we can think about, how do we overcome that story? How can we help them to overcome that story? How do we help them to see their leadership potential, right? Not just in those places where Dorothy is talking about, but how do we help them to see their potential in their whole life, right? Not just to see it in them, but help them to see it in them. That's the goal. Yeah. Anyone else? Last call.
I'll go for it. I'll be vulnerable.
Yes, Beth.
I jumped into administration pretty much out of college,
Oh.
and then when I started my family, took that step back, which happens often for women in college administration. And now that my oldest is 7, I've stepped back into this field. So that gap of 5 years. Where I was still doing things, but outside of athletics, it's that, I guess just that doubt of stepping back into the space with confidence and understanding that those other things that I was doing still have value, and that, the journey is what it is. And there were a lot of lessons learned along the way.
Yeah. And what leadership skills did you gain in those 5 years?
Right. I mean,
lot.
quite a few, right? Holding it down, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
try coordinating and wrangling a 5-year-old, 3, 4, 5-year-old at bedtime. Like,
right. It totally helps with student athletes and coaches and administrators, right? It's the same skill set.
It is exactly the same.
You have to keep a calm tone and sometimes lay down the law.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for leaning in and joining the conversation. I appreciate getting to see faces and participating in that back and forth. So Dorothy, thank you for having me and getting to join today. I really appreciate that. And I'll turn it back to you.
Of course, please take a second. We have 2 evaluation opportunities for you right now. Please take a second to use the QR code on the screen to fill out the session evaluation. I would go directly to Lacy. And when you guys have done that, I will share my screen.
Oh, that's just my contact info. So go
That's
ahead
your
and share
contact information. So we have the evaluation. But yes, all right, yes, there we go. Please take some time to complete the session evaluation for this session. If you were in the 1:30 session, we do know that ended abruptly. So while you have it here, please take some time to fill out the session evaluation for the 1:30 session if you attended that one too. We'll leave this up, but thank you so much for coming to Leadership Power Hour with Lacy Dichary. And we have one more concurrent session left and hope you guys enjoy. Thank you so much, Lacy.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Of course. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Yeah, good. I'd love to follow up.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.